somewhere in North Carolina, on a ridge road that turns to gravel and then to nothing, there's a spot where the fog sits low and thick, even at noon, even in July, like the mountain is breathing out and never breathing back in. A quick word before we go deeper. These stories don't end. There's a new unsolved one waiting here every night. If that's the kind of thing you'd leave on in the dark, subscribe and I'll keep them coming. Stand there long enough and you start to feel like the mountain is watching you back. The old timers called this place Brown Mountain, and they say lights dance along its ridge on certain nights. Not flashlight beams, not headlights on some far highway. Something else, floating and drifting, red and gold, rising up from the trees like a lantern, held by no hand at all. Men have written about these lights since before the Civil War. Scientists have chased them with instruments and cameras, and still, nobody can tell you for certain what they are. That's the thing about these mountains. They don't give up their secrets easy. The Appalachians are old, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, older, some say, than almost any mountain range left standing on this earth. Once, they stood taller than the Himalayas do today, jagged and sharp against a sky no human eye would ever see. Then came hundreds of millions of years of wind and rain and frost, wearing them down slow, rounding their shoulders, filling their hollows with soil dark as coffee grounds. What's left now are old bones, worn smooth, covered in green, and underneath that green, something strange still moves. Because these mountains are not simple piles of rock, they are riddled with caves that seem to have no bottom. They hold valleys where snow refuses to fall, even when the peaks above are buried white. They hide lakes where no lake should exist, and hollows where a shout thrown out loud comes back sounding like a whisper, or does not come back at all. Some of it, geologists can explain with karst limestone, with thermal inversion, with sinkholes formed by water eating away stone for 10,000 years. But some of it, even now, with satellites overhead and sensors buried in the dirt, nobody has fully explained. That gap between what we know and what we don't, that's where the stories live. Long before there were roads through these mountains, the Cherokee told of tunnels that opened into darkness and never seemed to end, places where a man could walk for a mile underground and never see the far wall. Later came the Scots-Irish settlers, climbing up into hollows so isolated some families didn't see a stranger for a full year. They brought their own tales of fairy lights and haunted hollows from the old country, and they laid those stories down on top of the mountain like a fresh coat of paint over old wood. The wood underneath was already strange. The paint just gave it a new name. And then there is the sound. Up and down the Blue Ridge and out along the coast where the mountains finally give way to the sea, people have heard booms rolling out of nowhere. No storm in the sky, no blast from a quarry, just a deep rolling thud, like a cannon fired somewhere far off, or a door slamming shut in a house the size of a county. Sailors along the coast called them the Seneca guns. Mountain folk inland have their own names for the same sound. Geologists still argue about where it comes from. Some say shifting rock deep underground. Some say sonic booms, bouncing strange off distant thunderheads. Nobody agrees. The mountain keeps that secret close, the way it keeps most of them. This is a range built for mystery, not because the people who live here are looking to invent one, but because the ground itself refuses to sit still and be understood. It hums in places, it swallows sound in others. It grows lights that dance without a source, and holes that drop down into darkness deeper than any rope has ever measured. Over the hours ahead, we're going to walk this ground together, ridge by ridge, hollow by hollow. We'll sit with the brown mountain lights and the men who spent their lives chasing them. We'll stand at the mouth of a natural tunnel, carved by nothing but patient water, and hear what the Cherokee said lived inside it. We'll listen for the panther scream that sounds too much like a woman crying, and the church that the hillside swallowed whole. None of these stories end with a clean answer. That's not how these mountains work. But if you let yourself sit in the fog a while and let your eyes adjust to the dark, the way the old folks did, you might start to understand why, after 300 years, nobody up here is in any hurry to explain it all away. Picture a ridgeline at first light, somewhere between Virginia and Tennessee. The sun has not yet cleared the eastern peaks. Fog sits in the low ground like milk poured into a bowl, thick and white and slow to move. This is the hour the old-timers called the mountain's breath, when cold air pools in the hollows and warm air lifts off the creeks, and the whole valley seems to exhale. The Appalachians do not look like other mountains. They are old, older than almost anything else standing on this continent. 300 million years of wind and rain have worn their peaks down to soft shoulders and rounded backs. There are no jagged teeth here, no bare granite spires stabbing at the sky. Just long green waves of stone, folded and refolded, covered in trees that have grown for centuries undisturbed. Geologists will tell you these mountains were once as tall as the Rockies. Time simply wore them down, patient as water on a stone. Walk into a hollow in early autumn, and you will feel the temperature drop 10 degrees in 20 steps. The air turns damp and mineral, smelling of wet leaves and cold creek stone. Rhododendron grows thick along the banks, its dark leaves curling tight against the chill. Somewhere a woodpecker works at a dead chestnut, the sound bouncing strange off the rock walls, arriving from a direction that makes no sense. But light here is filtered and green, falling through a canopy so dense that noon can feel like dusk. This land was settled slow, and it was settled hard. Cherokee towns had stood in these valleys for centuries before any white face came through the gap. Then came the Scots-Irish, pushed out of their own hard hills across the ocean, drawn to a land that looked like home. German families followed, bringing their own stories of wood spirits and things that lived under bridges. Enslaved and later free black families carried their own traditions into these same coves. Tales of haints and root magic that took hold in the same fog and found new life. 4 ways of seeing the world, all trying to explain the same strange ground. Picture a cabin from those early years, chinked with red clay, a stone chimney leaning slightly with age. Smoke curls up thin and blue in the cold morning air. A woman steps out with a bucket for the spring, her breath fogging in front of her, her wool shawl pulled tight. Somewhere below, in the valley bottom, a white haze sits over the creek, even though the sky above is clear and bright. She does not think this strange. She has seen it every morning of her life. It is simply how the mountain wakes up. The land itself made this kind of mystery easy to believe. Cast rock lies underneath much of this ground. Limestone eaten through by water over millions of years, riddled with hidden caves and sinkholes, and passages that connect in ways no map ever quite captures. Walk across a field and the ground might drop away beneath your boot, opening into a hole with no visible bottom. A creek might vanish into the rock and reappear a mile off, cold and clear, in a place it has no business being. Nobody living then had the tools to explain this, so they explained it another way. They called the hole a door to somewhere else. They called the vanished creek a sign. Winter here brings its own strangeness. In certain hollows, snow melts within hours, while the ridge above stays white for weeks. Warm air pools low, trapped by the shape of the land, holding a strange, gentle heat, even in January. The old families called these places warm hollows, and they built there when they could, grateful for ground that seemed to hold a kindness the rest of the mountain didn't offer. Nobody then knew the word for a thermal inversion. They only knew some ground was kinder than the rest, and kindness like that felt like a gift from something watching over them. At night, the ridge changes completely. Stars press close and bright, unclouded by any city glow, because there is no city glow to speak of. A whippoorwill calls from somewhere in the dark trees, its voice carrying strange distances through the folded land. Somewhere far off, a light might move along a distant slope where no road exists and no house stands. A man on his porch might watch it for a long while, saying nothing, before he finally goes inside. This is the country our story lives in. Old stone, old fog, old families pressed close against a land that never quite explained itself. Before we get to the lights and the lakes and the caves with no bottom, you need to feel this ground first. You need to smell the wet leaves, feel the cold in the hollow, and understand why people here learned early to trust their own eyes, even when what they saw made no sense at all. Picture a man named Jacob Cutshaw walking a deer path in 1768. He carries a long rifle over one shoulder and a bag of cornmeal on his back. His boots are wet from crossing a creek an hour before. He is not looking for trouble. He is looking for a flat piece of ground where his family can build a cabin before winter comes down off the ridges. Jacob is one of hundreds who came into these mountains in those years. Most of them were Scots-Irish, pushed out of the lowlands by land prices they could not pay. Some were German farmers who wanted quiet soil and a church bell they could ring themselves. They came up through the Shenandoah Valley and through gaps in the rock that looked like doors cut by a giant hand. They brought axes, seed corn, fiddles, and Bibles worn soft at the edges. At night, they camped where the trees broke enough to see the sky. And at night, they heard things. A woman named Ruth Ann Sizemore, who settled near what is now the Tennessee line, told her grandchildren about sounds that came down off the high rock with no wind to carry them. She called it a moan, low and long, like someone blowing across the top of a jug the size of a barn. Her husband thought it was wind moving through a hollow tunnel in the stone. She was not so sure. She had heard wind before, she said, and this was not that. These settlers did not have geologists to explain a sound. They had firelight and each other and long dark hours to fill. So they told stories. A boom that shook a cabin door was not a shift of rock deep in the earth. It was a warning. A patch of fog that sat in one hollow and never moved, even when the wind blew everywhere else, was not a trick of cold air pooling low. It was a place best left alone after sundown. Some of these settlers had already met people who knew the mountains far better than they did. Cherokee families had walked these ridges for longer than anyone could count in white man's years. They had names for the strange places already, names passed down through grandmothers who had heard them from their own grandmothers. A hunter named Swimming Deer from a Cherokee town near the Nolichucky is said to have warned a settler family not to build too close to a certain bold mountain where trees never grew, though no one could say why. He did not call it cursed. He called it simply a place that belonged to something else. African families brought here in chains carried their own way of listening to land, learned across water, and forced into new hills far from home. Enslaved men and women working iron furnaces near the Blue Ridge spoke of lights that walked along old paths at night, lights that had no lantern and no hand holding them. Some said these were the spirits of people lost on the trail before them. Others said the mountain itself was breathing out something that only looked like fire. Picture these three worlds meeting on the same ridgeline. A Scots-Irish farmer clearing a field. A Cherokee hunter following a trail his people had walked for centuries. An enslaved blacksmith banking a furnace fire at dusk, looking up at the tree line before he goes inside. Different languages, different gods, different reasons for fear or wonder, and yet each one, in their own way, is listening to the same mountain, and each one hears something they cannot explain away with plain words. A trapper named Elias Combs, working the French Broad River country in the early 1800s, kept a journal that still survives in fragments. He wrote of a night when his dogs would not stop growling at a hollow they usually crossed without a thought. He wrote of a green light low in the trees that moved like a man walking, though he saw no man. He did not call himself brave. He wrote that he simply did not go closer, and he did not feel foolish for staying back. These were not people prone to wild talk. They were farmers, hunters, blacksmiths, mothers rocking babies by low fires. They worked from dawn until their backs ached, and they did not have time to invent stories for entertainment. When Ruth Ann Sizemore spoke of the moaning rock, and Swimming Deer spoke of the empty bald, and an unnamed furnace worker spoke of the walking light, they were doing the same thing. They were trying to make sense of a mountain range that did not behave the way solid ground should behave. The land gave them booms with no storm behind them. It gave them fog that stayed still as a held breath. It gave them lights with no lanterns and paths that seemed to remember footsteps long after the walker was gone. Before the trains came, the mountains kept their own time. Roosters called at first light, and smoke curled up from cabin chimneys like slow grey ribbons against the green. Life in these hollows moved the way a creek moves, slow, steady, and shaped by whatever ground stood in the way. Men rose before dawn to work the land their fathers had cleared. Women stoked the fires and set the biscuits, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with the smell of frying salt pork drifting out over the yard. Children ran barefoot down dirt paths worn smooth by generations of feet before theirs. Nobody was in a hurry, because there was nowhere else worth being. Then the railroads came through, cutting into the ridges like a knife through old bread. Iron rails stretched across valleys that had never seen anything move faster than a horse. The trains brought coal cars and lumber, mail and strangers, and a new sound that echoed for miles. That long, low whistle became part of the mountain air, the way thunder was part of a summer storm. Folks set their whole day by that whistle. A farmer ploughing his field would hear it far off, a thin cry rolling down through the trees, and know it was known. A mother hanging wash on the line would hear it again come evening and start supper. The trains ran on schedule, mostly, cutting through fog and rain, and the long blue shadows of dusk, with the same patient rhythm every single day. But it was after dark that the rails turned strange. Somewhere along certain stretches, folks began to see a light, not the train itself, not a lantern swinging from a brakeman's hand, but a glow that hung above the tracks and moved on its own. It swayed gently side to side, the way a lantern does when a man carries it and walks. Except there was no man, there was no lantern, there was only the light. The old-timers had a name for it before they had an explanation. They called it the walking light, or sometimes the swinging light, and they talked about it the way you'd talk about a neighbor who kept odd hours. Not with fear, with a kind of tired familiarity, like it was just one more thing the mountains did that nobody needed to understand. You saw it, You nodded, and you went on home. Railroad men told the fullest stories because they saw it most. A brakeman walking the tracks at night to check the couplings would sometimes look up and see another light coming toward him from far off, swaying at the same easy pace as a man's stride. He would call out the way you'd call to a co-worker on a lonesome stretch of track. No voice answered back. The light kept coming, or sometimes it stopped, hovering there in the dark, like it was waiting on something, before it faded soft as a candle going out in a draught. The story most families told traced it back to a switchman who lost his life on the tracks, lantern still in his hand when the wheels came for him in the fog. They said his light kept walking the rails long after his body was buried on the hillside, still checking the couplings, still doing the job he never got to finish. Other families told it different. Some said it was a signal light with no signal behind it, a trick of gas rising up from low damp ground. Others said it was only marsh light, the kind that flickers over wet fields on a warm night, drifting close to the rails, because the rails ran through the lowest, wettest part of the hollow. Whatever it was, nobody in those hollows treated it like a monster or a warning. It was simply part of the landscape, the way the fog was part of the ridge, and the whistle was part of the evening. Grandmothers pointed it out to grandchildren from porch swings, the same way they'd point out a shooting star. Look there, they'd say. There goes the light again, walking its rounds, same as always. And the child would watch it sway there, in the dark, warm, under a quilt, feeling not scared, but strangely comforted, like the mountain itself was tending to something nobody else could see. That was the rhythm of those years. Work by day, rest by dusk, and now and then, out past the tree line, a small and steady light doing its rounds along the rails. It never asked to be understood. It only asked to be watched from a safe porch on a quiet night, while the crickets sang and the coffee went cold in your hand. This was mountain life before anyone thought to call it mystery. Just an old light, walking an old road, keeping company with the living, the only way it knew how. In the winter of 1929, in a valley near the Tennessee line, the ground opened up. A farmer named Ezra Combs woke to a sound like a giant swallowing. He walked out into his cornfield and found a hole where his fence line used to be, black and wet, wide as a barn. By the next spring, that hole was a lake. Nobody had dug it. Nobody had asked for it. It just came, the way weather comes, and it sat there full of cold water that no map had ever shown. The old-timers called it a wonder, but they said the word careful like it might bite. Some lakes in these mountains take 1,000 years to form. This one took a season. The water was clear at first, so clear you could see the tops of drowned trees standing below the surface like fingers reaching up for air they'd never get. Then the color changed. Some days it ran green as bottle glass. Some days it turned the flat gray of an old nickel. And nobody could say why the color moved like that, shifting with no rain, no wind, no reason anybody could point to. Ezra Combs said he heard singing out there some nights, low and far off, like a woman humming to a baby that wasn't hers. His wife heard it too, and she wasn't a woman given to fancy talk. She said it came off the water right around dusk, when the fog sat on the surface like a blanket somebody had thrown down and forgot to pick up. They never went out on that lake after dark. Most folks in the valley didn't either. Now, geologists have a word for what happened under Ezra Combs's field. They call it karst collapse. Under a lot of these mountains, water has been working on limestone for longer than anybody can count, hollowing out rooms and halls beneath the rock like a slow, patient thief. Sometimes the roof of one of those hollow rooms just gives out. The ground above it has nothing left to stand on, and down it goes, sudden as a trapdoor. Where the water table sits high, that new pit fills up fast, and a lake is born in a single night where a cornfield used to be. That is the tidy answer. It fits the rock. It fits the water. But it does not fit everything the valley remembers about that lake, and that is where the story keeps one foot outside the science, because the fish came back wrong. Old fishermen who worked that water in the years after said they pulled up catfish with skin pale as candle wax, fish that had never seen light, fish that had no business swimming near the surface of a lake barely a few years old. Some said those fish must have lived in the underground water below, swimming blind in the dark for who knows how long. And the collapse just opened a door they'd been waiting on their whole lives. Nobody has ever proven where those pale fish came from. Nobody has ever proven they didn't come from somewhere far below, someplace no man has mapped. And there is the matter of the cattle. Ezra Combs lost 2 heifers to that water in the first year, and both times the animals walked in calm as you please. No spooking, no bawling. Straight into the lake like they'd been called. A cow does not walk into cold water on a whim. Something drew them, or something told them to go, and nobody in that valley could say which. The lake is still there today, though the county gave it a plainer name than the one the old families use around their own tables. Fishermen visit it now. Tourists stop by the little pull-off on the county road to take a picture of the water and the drowned tree line still standing under the surface, black and patient, nearly 100 years on. Most of them never hear the story of how it got there. Most of them never hear the singing either, because most of them leave before dark. But the families who have lived along that valley for 5 generations will tell you the lake was not empty ground before it was water. They will tell you the earth does not open for nothing, that something underneath had been waiting, and the collapse only let it breathe. They cannot tell you what that something is. They only tell you to watch the fog when it settles low near dusk, and to listen close, because sound travels strange over water that was never supposed to be there at all. There's a hollow up past Grandfather Mountain where folks say sound just disappears. You can stand at one end and yell as loud as you want. A person 40 feet away won't hear a thing. Old-timers call it the Quiet Hollow, and they've been calling it that for longer than anyone can trace back. A woman named Ruth Combs told her grandkids about it every summer on the porch. She said her own grandfather lost a hunting dog in there once. He called and called, standing right at the tree line, and his voice just fell dead in the air, like a stone dropped in mud. He said it felt like the hollow ate the sound whole. Found the dog 3 hours later, sitting calm as you please, like nothing had happened at all, down at the general store in the valley. Men who'd spent their whole lives logging and trapping in those hills would trade stories like playing cards. One fellow swore he'd fired a rifle in that hollow and heard nothing but a soft cough, quiet as a closed door. Another said he'd screamed his brother's name after a bad fall and had to walk 200 yards before the sound would carry at all. They'd nod at each other over coffee, the way men do when they've all seen the same strange thing and don't need to argue about it. The preacher at the little white church on the ridge had his own explanation. He told his congregation the hollow was a place God had set aside, a pocket of silence for a world that never stopped making noise. He said, maybe it was a mercy, a place where a tired soul could go and not be found by anything, not even an echo. Some of the older women liked that idea. They'd walk up there sometimes, alone, just to stand in a silence that thick. But the trappers and the hunters had a rougher theory. They said something lived in there. Not a bear, Not a cat, nothing you could shoot or track, something that didn't want to be heard, and didn't want anyone else heard either. They'd go in for game and come out early, most of them, not scared exactly, just uneasy, the way you feel when a room goes quiet right before somebody says something you don't want to hear. Now the geologists who've walked that hollow with their instruments have a different story, and it's not as strange, but it's not simple either. The hollow sits low between two ridges that curve inward, almost like cupped hands. Sound waves that travel into a bowl shape like that get bounced and folded back on themselves, cancelling out before they ever reach an ear. Add in the thick stands of rhododendron, the damp moss that swallows vibration like a sponge, and the deep leaf litter built up over centuries, and you've got a place built by nature to hold silence the way a jar holds water. That explanation satisfies most folks passing through with a camera and a notebook. It does not satisfy everyone who has actually stood inside that hollow, because here's the piece the science doesn't quite reach. People who've spent real time in there say the silence comes and goes. Some days you can hear a normal conversation 40 feet off, clear as a bell over water. Other days, on no particular kind of weather, the same walk turns dead quiet within a few steps. No fog rolling through, no wind picking up, nothing different you could point to and say, there, that's the cause. A ranger who worked that section of trail for near 20 years kept a little notebook of his own, off the record, just for himself. He wrote down the days the hollow went quiet and the days it didn't. He told a hiker once, years back, that he never found a pattern, no connection to rain, to season, to time of day, just quiet when it wanted to be quiet, same as an old dog that only barks at strangers it decides it doesn't like. The Cherokee who lived in these hills long before any of this had their own way of speaking about it, and it wasn't about acoustics or terrain shape at all. They spoke of places in the mountains that belonged to the old spirits, places you were meant to pass through with respect and not much talking. A hollow that swallowed sound wasn't a mystery to solve. It was a boundary, a line, where the mountain asked for quiet, and you gave it, because that was simply how you moved through a land that was older than you, older than your grandfather's grandfather, older than the first road ever cut through the trees. Whatever the true cause, the hollow keeps its secret well. Even the loudest man in the valley goes quiet once he steps inside it. Long before any road cut through these ridges, the Cherokee had names for this land. They called the great smoke that hangs over the peaks Shakenage. It means the place of blue smoke. They did not see it as strange. They saw it as breath, slow and steady, rising off a body that was alive. Their stories did not treat the mountains like scenery. They treated them like elders. Every ridge had a reason. Every hollow had a memory. The fog that pooled in the valleys was not weather to them. It was a spirit moving from one place to another, taking its time, the way an old woman might walk between rooms of a house she has lived in her whole life. The Cherokee told of Non-Yunuwai, a stone giant who wandered these ridges, eating the people who crossed his path. Hunters could hear his footsteps before they saw him, and the ground itself seemed to warn them, trembling faint and low. Some elders say the giant was finally tricked and destroyed near a river crossing, and that the stones scattered from his body are still out there, half buried in creek beds, waiting for someone to notice they do not look quite like the rocks around them. They spoke too of the Nanahi, the people who live inside the mountains. The word means the ones who are always here. The Nanahi were said to move through solid rock like it was smoke, appearing near drumbeats and vanishing before a hand could touch them. When settlers later found tunnels carved clean through solid ridges, openings that seemed too straight, too deliberate to be an accident of water and stone. Some old Cherokee families already had an answer. They said the Nanahi built doors between their world and this one, and that a mountain with a hole clean through it was not a mystery. It was an address. Virginia's natural tunnel sits exactly at that crossing point between story and stone. It is a passage nearly 900 feet long, cut straight through a ridge of solid limestone, wide enough that a train runs through it today. Geologists say water did this work, patient and slow, dissolving the rock over hundreds of thousands of years, following cracks that gave it a path of least resistance. That answer is true. But truth and meaning are not always the same thing. And for people who walked this ground long before drills and dynamite, the tunnel was not just a feature of the land, it was a place where the mountain had opened its mouth. The Shawnee, who moved through these same ridges on hunting paths and trade routes, carried different stories about the same terrain, and their versions did not always agree with Cherokee tradition. Some Shawnee elders spoke of underground rivers that connected distant valleys, of caves that were doorways rather than dead ends. Both peoples treated the deep places of the mountains with caution, not fear exactly, but the kind of respect you give a neighbor whose habits you do not fully understand. You do not walk into that tunnel at dusk. You do not camp too close to a hollow where the sound goes strange. These were not superstitions built from nothing. They were rules built from centuries of watching this land behave in ways that did not always follow a simple pattern. When settlers arrived, they brought their own frameworks and pressed them over what was already here. Scots-Irish families saw fairy folk and haunted hollows. German settlers saw omens and warnings passed down through church and hearth. Cherokee guides sometimes walked white surveyors past the same tunnels and balds and glowing ridgelines, translating one worldview into another. And something was always lost in that translation. A hole through a mountain became either a geological curiosity or a portal, depending entirely on who was asked and what they needed to believe. What survives from those early stories is not proof of anything supernatural. No modern geologist will tell you the Nanahi carved natural tunnel, and no rigorous survey has found stone giants buried along the Holston River. But the stories survive anyway, passed mouth to mouth for longer than anyone kept written records. And they point towards something worth noticing. The Cherokee were not confused about their landscape. They were paying close attention to it, cataloging its moods and its openings the way a good doctor catalogues a patient's history. The tunnels were real. The fog was real. The sounds that moved strangely through certain hollows were real, long before any settler wrote them down. The land remembers longer than any single people who lived on it, and every group that has passed through these ridges has tried to give a name to the same handful of stubborn, unexplained things. That is the thread running under all of it. Different words, different centuries, the same mountain breathing the same blue smoke into the same tired sky. There's a ridge outside a town in West Virginia that folks say breathes, not wind through leaves, not water over stone. A low sound, steady as a heartbeat, coming from some place nobody can point to. They call it the hum. And in the 1960s, a man named Carl Neff decided he was tired of hearing about it secondhand. Carl ran the hardware store in town. He was not a scientist. He was not a ghost hunter. He was a man who liked things to make sense. And this hum had bothered him since he was a boy sleeping with his window open in July. So he started asking questions. He talked to old-timers who said their grandparents heard it too, back before the roads came through. He talked to a schoolteacher who swore the sound got louder before a storm, like the mountain was clearing its throat. Carl started keeping a notebook, nothing fancy, just a black composition book he carried in his coat pocket. He wrote down the date, the time, the weather, and whether he heard the hum that night. He did this for 11 years. By the end, he had pages and pages of numbers and notes, and a pattern that made the hair stand up on his arms, even though he never believed in ghosts. The hum came most often on still nights, when the air was heavy and the fog sat low in the valley. It came less in wind. It almost never came in the dead of winter, when the ground was frozen hard as iron. Carl noticed something else too. The hum seemed to move. Some nights it sat under the ridge to the east. Other nights it drifted west, like it was walking the length of the mountain while everybody slept. He wrote letters to geologists at 2 different universities. One wrote back and said it was likely microseismic activity. Tiny tremors too small to feel, but strong enough to hear if the rock and the air lined up just right. Appalachian rock is old, folded and cracked 100 different ways over hundreds of millions of years, and sound can travel through it, strange, bouncing and bending along fault lines nobody's mapped. The other geologist wasn't so sure. He wrote back that the pattern Carl described, the way the sound seemed to travel and fade with the weather, sounded more like an atmospheric trick. Warm air layers sitting over cold air can carry sound for miles, he said, the same way you can sometimes hear a train whistle from a town that's nowhere near a rail line. 2 scientists, 2 answers, and neither one could say for certain which was right. Carl kept listening anyway. He built himself a listening station, if you could call it that, just a lawn chair on his back porch, and a thermos of coffee some nights, waiting for the mountain to speak. His wife thought he'd lost his mind a little, but she never told him to stop. She said later that she'd catch him out there at 2 in the morning, sitting dead still, head tilted like a man trying to catch the last word of a sentence somebody started years ago. What Carl found, in the end, wasn't an answer. It was a shape, a pattern in the fog and the stillness, and the low pressure before a storm, a set of conditions that seemed to call the hum out of the ground. He never recorded the sound itself. He tried, with a reel-to-reel machine borrowed from the radio station, but the microphone caught wind and crickets and his own breathing and nothing else. Whatever made the hum did not care to be caught on tape. Some folks in town still say Carl's notebook proved something. Others say all he proved was that a man can talk himself into hearing anything if he listens hard enough, long enough. In the dark, both things might be true at once. That's the trouble with a mountain that hums. It doesn't explain itself, and it doesn't apologize either. Carl passed in 1981, and his notebook sits in a drawer at the Historical Society now, worn soft at the corners from years in his coat pocket. People still drive out to that ridge on still summer nights, park their trucks along the gravel shoulder, and roll their windows down. Most nights, they hear nothing but crickets and the wind moving through the tops of the trees. But every so often, somebody swears they catch it, low, steady, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the mountain itself is breathing slow in its sleep, and you happen to be standing close enough to hear. High on the ridgelines of the southern Appalachians, there are places where the trees simply stop. No fire cut them down, no storm tore them out. The forest just gives up, and grass takes over, rolling out like a green sea across the top of the mountain. Folks call these places bolds, and if you ask anyone who has stood in one, they will tell you the same strange thing. It feels like walking into a hole in the sky. A woman named Ruth, who spent 40 years hiking the Rhone Highlands, told her story slow and careful, like she was still deciding if she believed it herself. She said she reached the top of Round Bold just before sunset, alone, and the wind stopped. not slowed down, stopped. She said the grass around her feet went still, like a held breath, and for a few seconds she could hear her own heartbeat and nothing else. Then the wind came back all at once, and she said it felt like the mountain had been listening to her. She is not the only one who talks that way about the balds. A retired forest ranger named Dale worked the roan for 22 years, and he kept a private notebook of things he could not explain. He wrote that compasses acted strange up there, spinning a few degrees off true north before settling again. He wrote that hikers sometimes reported hearing voices in the grass, low and murmuring, like a crowd of people talking just out of sight. He never heard the voices himself, but he believed the people who told him. He said their faces changed when they talked about it, like they were back there again, standing in that open field with the sky pressing close. Scientists have their own explanations, and they are worth hearing. Some balds may have started as Cherokee ceremonial grounds, cleared on purpose, and kept open by fire and grazing animals long before European settlers arrived. Others may be scars from old landslides, or places where thin, acidic soil never let trees take root again after some ancient disturbance. Livestock grazing in the 1800s likely kept many balds open long after their original course. Every one of these explanations is reasonable. None of them fully explains why these particular open patches sit exactly where they do, why they hold their shape decade after decade instead of growing back to forest like everywhere else on the ridge. A geologist who studied the Rhone Highlands for the state once said something that stuck with a lot of people who heard it. She said the soil samples showed nothing unusual, no strange minerals, no chemical reason for the grass to win over the trees. She said plainly that by every measurement she had, those balds should be forest, and they are not. Then there are the stories that go back further, past written records, carried down through Cherokee oral tradition. Some tellings speak of a great flying creature, sometimes called the Ulagu, so massive it could carry off children, and say the balds are where warriors burned the mountaintops, trying to drive the beast away, clearing the trees so it would have nowhere left to hide. Other versions speak differently of the land itself choosing to stay open, a kind of clearing meant for gathering, for ceremony, for something sacred that needed open sky above it. These stories were not meant as guesses about geology. They were explanations passed down with care, meant to hold meaning long after the reason was forgotten. A woman named Patricia, who grew up near Roan Mountain and heard these stories from her grandmother, said it best. She said her grandmother never called the balds empty. She called them clearings, not places where something failed to grow, but places kept open on purpose by something older than the forest around them. Patricia said she still feels that difference every time she hikes up there. The forest feels like it is growing. The bald feels like it is waiting. That word keeps coming up in the stories people tell about these places. Waiting. Hikers describe a stillness that feels aware, not accidental. They describe standing in tall grass, with fog curling low around their boots, and mountains rolling out in every direction, like frozen waves, and feeling watched in a way that brings no fear with it, only a kind of hush. Nobody in these stories describes danger. They describe attention, a sense that the ground under their feet knows they are there. Science can explain much of how a bald forms, and how it might be kept clear across generations. It has a harder time explaining why people who visit these places again and again, across 100 years of accounts, describe the exact same feeling. Not fear, not wonder exactly either. Something closer to recognition, like the mountain remembers something the hiker does not. And for one long moment on the ridge, the two of them meet in the silence. Ask 10 old-timers in these mountains what walks the ridges at night, and you will get 10 different answers. But listen close, and you will notice something strange. The details keep lining up. A logger in West Virginia calls it the wood booger. He says it stands 7 feet tall, covered in hair the color of wet bark. A farmer in East Tennessee calls it something else. He says it smells like a wet dog left out in the rain for a week, and it walks on 2 legs like a man, but wrong somehow, like the knees bend a little different. A Cherokee elder in the snowbird community might tell you about Sul Kalu, the slant-eyed giant who ruled these mountains before anyone else came. Different names, different counties, same shape moving through the trees. Here is where it gets strange. These people never met. Some of them lived 100 years apart. Some of them lived 200 miles apart, separated by ridges so steep you'd need 3 days just to cross one. And yet the stories rhyme like verses of the same old song, passed hand to hand across a distance that should have broken the thread completely. The smell comes up again and again. Not just bad, specific witnesses across 4 states describe it the same way. Wet fur, rot, something like a skunk mixed with a dead animal left too long in summer heat. You'd think if people were only borrowing tales from their neighbors, the details would drift and change, the way a story always changes when it travels mouth to mouth. But this one holds its shape. The sounds match too. Not a growl, not a howl. People across the ridge describe a scream that starts low and climbs high, almost human, almost not, like a woman crying out in the deep dark of the woods. Loggers in the 1940s wrote about it in old company records, describing 3-toed tracks pressed into red clay near their camps. Hunters in the 1970s described the same scream, word for word, in interviews they gave decades later, never having read those old logging records at all. Some folks call this a coincidence built out of common fears. Day. Scared man in the dark hears an owl or a bobcat, and his mind fills in the rest with old stories his grandmother told him. That is the simple explanation, and it might be the true one. Bobcats do scream like that. So do foxes, in the right season, in the right kind of cold. Sound behaves strangely in these hollows. As we already know, a cry from 2 ridges over can arrive sounding closer, stranger, more human than it has any right to be. But other folks point to something harder to explain away: the tracks. Researchers who study these reports say the prints found across multiple states decades apart show a consistent pattern: 3 toes, sometimes 4, pressed deep into soft ground, spaced in a stride too long for any bear standing on its hind legs. Bears do walk upright sometimes, for a few steps, chasing balance more than distance. What these witnesses describe is different: a walking gait, sustained, purposeful, something moving through the trees the way a man moves, not the way an animal lurches. Geology plays its part in this too. These mountains are riddled with hidden hollows, sinkholes and cave systems that swallow sound and light alike. A creature, if one exists, would have places to hide that go back further than any survey map. Karst country breeds mystery, simply by being what it is, full of chambers no human has ever mapped, full of passages that vanish under the leaf litter and never show up again. The old Cherokee stories treated Sul Kalu with a kind of respect that outsiders often miss. He was not a monster to fear. He was a guardian, older than the roads, older than the towns, tied to the mountain itself the way roots are tied to soil. That framing matters. Before settlers came with their own fears and their own names for the dark, the people who lived here longest saw this presence as part of the land, not an intruder on it. Nobody has a body. Nobody has a bow. What we have is testimony, spread across 2 centuries from people who never read each other's letters, never heard each other's stories, and still somehow arrived at the same shape in the dark. Maybe that is memory playing tricks across generations. Maybe that is simply what fear looks like when it takes root in mountain soil. Or maybe something really does move through these ridges, patient and quiet, leaving nothing behind but a smell, a scream, and a track in the red clay that fades before morning light. There is a river in these mountains that folks say runs the wrong way. Not all the time, not for everyone who looks, but often enough, and told by enough different voices, across enough different hollows, that the story has worn itself a deep groove in the memory of these hills. They call it the Backward River, and if you ask 10 old-timers where to find it, you will get 10 different answers, and every single one of them will swear they saw it with their own eyes. The river most tied to the legend is the New River, and there is a reason for that. Geologists will tell you the New River is anything but new. Some say it may be one of the oldest rivers on the entire planet, older than the mountains it cuts through, older than the Atlantic Ocean itself. It flows north, up through Virginia, and into West Virginia, which already feels strange to anyone raised on the idea that rivers run down and away. South, toward the sea, water is supposed to chase the ocean. This one turns its back on it. That simple fact, a river flowing north instead of south, was enough to plant the seed. But legend does not stop at strange. Legend needs a story. And so the story grew arms and legs. Old families in the New River Valley used to say that on certain nights, under a certain slant of moon, the current would seem to slow, then stop, then push backward against itself, like the whole river had changed its mind. Some called it a trick of the eye, others were not so sure. A trapper's journal from the early 1800s, kept in a small county archive in Virginia, describes a night on the river where his canoe would not move forward, no matter how hard he paddled. He wrote that the water pushed against him like a hand, gentle but firm, turning his boat back the way he came. He blamed it on a hidden current, an eddy he could not see. But he also wrote that he heard something like a woman's laughter drifting off the water that night, and he never explained that part at all. The Cherokee who lived along these waters long before any trapper arrived had their own understanding, one that did not require an eddy or an explanation. Some of their stories described the river as a living thing with its own will, capable of changing course when it pleased, especially in places where the land itself felt old and watchful. To them, a river running backward was not broken or wrong. It was simply the river doing what rivers full of spirit sometimes do. The mystery was not a problem to solve. It was a fact of a living land. By the time Scots-Irish settlers moved into these valleys, the story had picked up new details, the way a snowball picks up more snow, rolling downhill. Some versions say the river only runs backward on the night before a death in the valley, a kind of warning carried in the current. Other versions say it happens every 7 years, tied to some quiet rhythm nobody has ever managed to track. A few tellers, the more mischievous kind, will say it happens whenever a liar tries to cross the water, and the river simply refuses to carry a false tongue toward its destination. Modern science offers a calmer, if less thrilling, piece of the puzzle. The New River's unusual northward path is real and well documented, carved over millions of years before the surrounding peaks even finished rising. A survivor river that cut through rock faster than the mountains could grow around it. That much is settled. What is not settled, and probably never will be, is Why so many people across 2 centuries and several different cultures reported the same specific sensation. A river that seemed to hesitate, or slow, or turn against its own current on certain still nights. Some geologists point to seasonal debris dams, floating logs and brush that pile up and shift water flow just enough to create a false backward pull near the banks. Others mention wind moving across the surface of slow water, pushing small ripples upstream in a way that could fool a tired eye in dim light. Neither theory explains the sound the trapper heard, or why grandmothers 3 counties apart, who never met and likely never read the same book, told their grandchildren the exact same tale. Maybe the river only runs backward in the telling, passed mouth to mouth, until the current of the story became stronger than the current of the water. Or maybe, on certain nights, in certain quiet bends, where the fog sits low and the moon hangs just right, the water still remembers a time before it decided which way to flow at all. High up on a ridge that folks in Tazewell County called Bear Wallow, there used to be a hole in the ground. Some say it's still there, hidden under 100 years of leaves and fallen limbs. Old-timers called it the bottomless pit, and they did not mean that as a figure of speech. They meant it plain and simple. Nobody who dropped a rock down that hole ever heard it land. Picture a mouth in the earth, about as wide as a wagon wheel. The edges are limestone, grey and wet, slick with moss the color of old copper. Ferns grow right up to the rim, leaning in like they're curious too. A cool breath rises out of that hole even in July, a kind of cold that makes your arms prickle on a hot afternoon. And if you kneel down and look in, you see nothing. Not darkness exactly, just an absence, like the ground simply gave up and stopped being ground. Settlers in the 1800s tried to sound it. That was the word they used, sound it, like sailors measuring the sea. They tied stones to rope, then rope to more rope, then finally gave up on rope altogether and started dropping things and counting seconds. A grandfather in one family account is said to have dropped a lit lantern down that hole, just to watch how long the light lasted. He counted past 60 before the glow finally winked out, swallowed by the dark curve of the shaft. 60 seconds of falling is a long way down, longer than most caves in these mountains have any business going. Geologists will tell you this kind of pit is not impossible at all. The ridge and valley province sits on old limestone and dolomite, rock that dissolves slow over thousands of years, the way sugar dissolves in tea, just slower than any human eye could ever watch. Water finds a crack. The crack becomes a channel. The channel becomes a throat, and the throat swallows itself deeper and deeper until you get a sinkhole, a shaft, sometimes a whole cave system, stretched out under a mountain like veins under skin. This is called karst, and it explains a lot. It explains why the Appalachians are honeycombed with tunnels and pits from Virginia clear down into Alabama. What karst does not explain, not fully, is why certain pits in these mountains seem to defy every measurement anyone has tried. Cavers, with modern gear, real rope, and real lights and real training, have gone back to some of these old bottomless pits with the tools to settle the question once and for all. And more than one team has come back saying the shaft narrows, then opens into a chamber too tight for a person to pass, and beyond that chamber, nobody knows. The hole does not end where the equipment says it should. It just keeps going somewhere the instruments cannot follow. There is a story, passed mostly through families in the coal fields, about a preacher who tried to bless one of these pits, shut back before the First World War. He is said to have stood at the rim with his Bible held out over the dark, praying for God to seal the earth back up the way it was before Adam's fall. The wind picked up while he prayed. Folks say cold and sudden, rising right out of the hole itself, like the mountain was breathing out. He finished his prayer. The hole did not close. It's still there, they say, still breathing, still cold in July. Some geologists offer a simple answer for that breath of cold air. Caves hold a steady temperature year-round, usually somewhere around 55 degrees, because they sit below the reach of the seasons. When warm summer air meets that cold air rising from below, you get a draft that feels almost alive. That much is settled science, plain as a textbook, but it does not explain the lantern. It does not explain 60 seconds of falling light in a mountain that by every modern survey should not have a shaft deep enough to swallow it. Maybe the story grew taller with each retelling, the way stories do around a fire or a kitchen table. Maybe a nervous man counted seconds wrong, his heart racing faster than any clock. Or maybe there really is a hollow place under these old mountains that nobody has found the bottom of. Not with rope, not with modern gear, not with 100 years of trying. The mountain keeps that answer to itself, the way it keeps so much else, cold and quiet and just out of reach, right below where the ferns lean in to look. Not everyone in these mountains believes in bottomless caves or humming ridges. Plenty of folks who grew up here will tell you flat out that the mystery is not much of a mystery at all, and you should hear them out because their case is a good one. Start with the coves themselves. A dark cove in mountain language is a deep hollow where the sun barely reaches the floor. Steep walls block the light for most of the day, sometimes all of it, and cold air pools in the bottom like water in a bowl. Botanists call this a refuge. Ferns grow there that belong in forests 400 miles north. Moss grows thick as carpet, soft and green, and older than the road that brought you in. And skeptics point to this place and say, look, this is your answer. Not magic. Microclimate. A retired geologist from Boone spent 30 years mapping these hollows, and he had a simple rule he taught his students. Before you call something unexplainable, explain the ground first. Cold air sinks, warm air rises, fog forms where the two meet and can't decide who's in charge. A cave that seems to breathe is just following the pressure outside it, exhaling when the weather drops, inhaling when it climbs. He measured it himself, cave by cave, with instruments that don't care about legend. The numbers, he said, tell a story too. It's just a duller one. The brown mountain lights get the same treatment from doubters. In 1922, the United States Geological Survey sent a man out to study the glow, and he came back with a simple conclusion: headlights from a valley road, reflecting up off low cloud, doing exactly what light does when it bounces. Case closed, as far as he was concerned, and, for a lot of scientists since, that answer has held up fine. Cars still drive that road. Fog still sits in that valley. The math still works. Sinkhole lakes get explained the same way. Karst geology is patient and thorough, and it does not need a monster to hollow out stone. Water finds a weak seam in limestone and works it for 10,000 years, wearing the rock down grain by grain until the ceiling gives way. A lake appears where solid ground used to be, and to a family standing at the edge, it looks like the earth cracked open on purpose. To a geologist, it looks like erosion doing its slow, patient job. No spirit required, no warning needed, just time, water, and stone, losing an argument it never had a chance of winning. And here is the thing about these skeptics. They are not wrong. The cold air really does pool in those coves, The headlights really do bend through fog. The limestone really does dissolve, slowly, the way a sugar cube dissolves in a cup of coffee left too long on the stove. Every one of these explanations is sound science, tested and repeated, and written down in journals nobody outside a university will ever read. If you want a clean answer, the skeptics have one waiting for you, and it is not a lazy answer. It took work to get there, but sit with them long enough, buy them a second cup of coffee, and something changes. Ask the geologist why the lights at Brown Mountain still get reported on nights, with no fog and no road traffic below. Ask him why they show colors that headlights don't make. Blue and red and a green that has no bulb behind it. He'll go quiet for a second. Ask the man who mapped the Coves why one hollow near Linville runs 8 degrees colder than the physics of trapped air should allow. Measured on instruments he calibrated himself. He'll tell you it's an outlier. He'll tell you outliers happen, but you'll notice he doesn't look you in the eye when he says it. And you'll notice he mentions that same cove again later, unprompted, like it's been sitting in the back of his mind for years. That's the gap, not a canyon, just a crack. But it's there in almost every explanation if you look close enough. The science covers most of the mountain. It covers the fog, the cold air, the crumbling stone, the bending light. What it doesn't cover, not quite, not fully, is the handful of nights when all those explanations line up and the phenomenon still doesn't behave the way the explanation says it should. The skeptics know this. The honest ones will even tell you so, in their own careful, measured way, before they change the subject and pour you more coffee. And somewhere behind them, up in the dark cove, where the ferns grow thick and the air runs colder than it should, something keeps right on doing what it's always done. There's a place off a gravel road in the Blue Ridge, but maps still name, though almost nobody lives there anymore, call it Fog Hollow, because that's what the old-timers called it, and because the real name doesn't matter as much as what happened to the people who stayed. In the 1930s, it had a church, a mill, and about 40 families working small farms cut into the hillside like shelves. By the 1960s, it had 6 families left. By the 1980s, it had none. Ask why, and the answer you get depends on who you ask and how long they're willing to stand there talking to you. The folks who left, and their children after them, tell it the same way. The fog came up, that hollow different than it came anywhere else. It didn't roll in with the evening like fog does most places. It pooled. It sat in the low ground, like water filling a bowl, thick and white and heavy as cream. And it did that on days when the rest of the mountain stood clear and blue and ordinary. A woman named Ruth Coldiron, who grew up there and left at 19, told a folklore researcher in 1988 that the fog had a smell to it. Not rot, not mud. She said it smelled like extinguished candles, like a room right after you blow one out. She wasn't the only one who noticed. Neighbors talked about losing their bearings inside that fog, even on land they'd walked their whole lives. Hey, man could step off his own porch, walk 30 feet to his woodpile, and come back turned around, unsure which way faced the road. Livestock got spooked in it for no reason anyone could see. Dogs wouldn't go past the tree line when the fog sat low. And dogs, most folks will tell you, don't lie about what scares them. The families who stayed the longest say they heard things in that fog they never heard on clear nights. Singing, some of them said, low and far off, like a congregation, 2 ridges away, except there was no congregation. 2 ridges away, because the church in the hollow was the only one for miles, and its pews had been empty since the mill closed. Others heard footsteps on the porch boards, with nobody there to make them. A man named Otis Bailey, who ran the last farm in the hollow into the 1970s, told his grandson he'd hear his own name called from the fog some mornings, clear as a shout there, and he'd go out onto the step and find nothing but white, all the way to the fence line. None of these people wanted attention for it. That's the part worth sitting with. Ruth Cold Iron didn't tell her story to get famous. She told it once to one researcher because she was old and figured somebody ought to have it on paper before she was gone. Otis Bailey never told a newspaper anything. He told his grandson at the supper table, the way you'd pass down a recipe or a warning about a bad well. These weren't people looking to be believed. They were people who had already decided a long time ago that belief from strangers didn't matter much. What mattered was that they knew what they'd lived through, and they weren't going to let it get talked out of them by anybody with a clipboard. That kind of certainty cost something. Ruth Cold Iron said her own children thought she was exaggerating, softening a hard childhood into something stranger and easier to tell. Otis Bailey got called superstitious by men who'd never spent a night in that hollow. But there's a kind of peace that comes from saying a true thing out loud, even if nobody claps for it. Ruth said once that she stopped worrying, somewhere in her 60s, whether people believed the fog had a voice in it. She'd heard it. That was hers to keep, whether or not it traveled well. Science offers its explanations, and they're not foolish ones. Cold air pools in low ground, the same way water does, trapped by warmer air above it, and that can hold fog in a bowl-shaped hollow far longer than the surrounding slopes. Sound bends and carries strangely through temperature layers, throwing a voice from a mile off into what sounds like your own front porch. None of that is nonsense. But it doesn't explain why this hollow and not the one next to it, and it doesn't explain why every family who ever lived there long enough told some version of the same strange story, independent of each other, decades apart. The mill is gone now. The church roof fell in sometime in the 90s, but the fog still pools there most mornings, thick and patient, exactly the way Ruth Cold Iron described it before she passed. Nobody farms that hollow anymore. The land remembers, even when the people who once lived there are the only ones left to say what it remembers doing. There is a place in the mountains where the rock itself curves like a doorway. Folks call it a natural bridge, and for a long time people did not believe such a thing could form on its own. It rises high above a creek bed, a slab of stone stretched clean across open air, holding up nothing but sky. Stand under it, and you feel small, the way you feel standing under a held breath. The Cherokee had a name for this kind of place, long before any surveyor drew it on a map. To them, it was not a bridge at all in the way we think of bridges. It was a place where the land had opened a door, and something on the other side had chosen to leave it standing. They did not build shrines there, but they walked around it with care, the way you might walk past a house where someone was sleeping. Geologists will tell you exactly how a stone bridge like this forms. Water finds a weak seam in limestone, and it works that seam for thousands of years, patient as anything alive could never be. The water hollows out a tunnel below, and the rock above holds firm because it happens to be harder, denser, stubborn in a way the rest of the hill was not. Eventually, the creek finds a new path, and what is left behind is an arch empty underneath, solid on top, looking for all the world like something built on purpose. That is the science, and it satisfies most people right up until they stand beneath one of these arches themselves, because up close, the stone does not look like it wore away. It looks like it was shaped. The curve is too even, the underside too smooth, like the hand of a giant mason had pressed his thumb along soft clay and let it dry into rock. You can know the geology and still feel the doubt creep in. quiet as fog, rolling into a hollow. The old-timers around these bridges tell a different kind of story, one that has nothing to do with water and seams. They say the mountains needed a way across for something that did not walk like a man. Some say it was a road for spirits, a place where the dead crossed over from one hollow to the next on certain nights of the year. Others say animals used it first, deer and elk moving along a ridgeline older than any name we have given it, and the bridge was simply where the land agreed to let them pass. Trees near these arches grow strange if you look close enough. Oaks lean away from the stone instead of toward the light, as though something about the arch pushes at them even from a distance. Old farmers who cleared land nearby often left a ring of untouched woods around the bridge itself, even when good soil sat right underneath it. They never gave a clear reason. They just said the ground did not want to be worked there, and they left it be. Cattle do the same thing. If you turn them loose in a field that holds one of these formations, they graze right up to the tree line and stop, grazing in a perfect half moon around the stern, never crossing under the arch, even when the grass on the other side grows tall and sweet. Ranchers noticed this for generations before anyone thought to write it down. An animal does not care about legend. An animal only knows what its body tells it, and something in that ground tells them to stay back. The creek beneath the bridge runs colder than the water around it, even in the fat heat of August. Folks who have waded through say it feels like stepping into a spring straight off a mountain peak, though the source is only a few hollows away and no colder than any other stream. Nobody has measured it properly, not with modern instruments, though a few university students tried it once with thermometers and came away more confused than when they started. Maybe the water only runs cold because it moves through deep limestone that never sees the sun. Maybe the trees only lean because the wind funnels strange through a gap in solid rock. Maybe the cattle only stop because the shadow falls wrong under the arch, throwing shapes their old animal brains do not trust. Every one of these explanations holds a grain of truth, and not one of them explains all of it at once. The bridge still stands, the way it has stood since before any wagon rolled through these hills. Yet, it does not need us to believe anything about it. It only needs the water to keep finding its own way around, the trees to keep leaning where they lean, and the cattle to keep grazing in that same warm half moon, season after season, like the land itself is still keeping a promise nobody remembers making. There's a place in the mountains near the Virginia and Tennessee border where hunters say the needle on a compass just gives up. It doesn't point north. It doesn't point anywhere. It spins slow, like a dog turning circles before it lies down, and then it stops wherever it wants. Old-timers marked the spot with a pile of stones years ago, just so nobody would wander through it by accident at night. You can find the same story almost anywhere the old mountains rise. A patch of woods in West Virginia, a hollow outside a small town in Georgia. A ridge in the Blue Ridge chain, where deer hunters swear their gear just stops working the way it should. Ask 5 people what causes it, and you'll get 5 answers, and every single one of them will be certain they're right. The geologists have a word for part of it. Magnetic declination, they call it. Certain rocks in these mountains carry iron in strange uneven pockets, laid down 1 billion years ago, when this land was still forming. Where those pockets sit close to the surface, a compass needle bends toward the metal instead of true north. It's not magic. It's just old iron, buried deep, doing what iron does. But here's where the story gets harder to explain away. Some of these spots have been tested by surveyors with modern equipment, and the readings don't match what a simple iron deposit should produce. The pull is too strong in one direction. Then it shifts, as if something underground were moving. Nobody's found the vein of ore that would explain the strength of it. The rock samples come back ordinary. And still the needle spins. You hear the same kind of story from other corners of the country, and that's worth sitting with for a moment. Up in Michigan, there's a spot folks call a gravity hill, where a car in neutral seems to roll uphill instead of down. Out in California, there's a stretch of road with the same trick. Scientists say it's an optical illusion, a trick the slope plays on your eyes because the horizon is tilted wrong. Maybe that's true, but the people who've stood at those spots for 40 years will tell you it doesn't feel like an illusion. It feels like the ground itself has an opinion. The Appalachian spots carry an older flavor than the gravity hills out west. The mountains here are ancient, some of the oldest exposed rock on the entire planet, folded and crushed and lifted long before the Rockies or the Sierras ever existed. That kind of age does something to a place. The rock has been squeezed so many times in so many directions that nobody can say for certain what pockets of mineral, what folds of ancient stone sit under any given hillside. A compass anomaly here might come from a deposit nobody's ever mapped, buried under 300 million years of mountain building. The Cherokee, who lived through these ridges long before the surveyors came, had their own way of understanding these places. They didn't need the compass to tell them something. Some spots simply carried a different kind of weight, a stillness that pressed on the chest, and their stories treated the ground itself as something that remembered. A place where the needle spins wasn't broken. It was marking a boundary, a threshold between one kind of ground and another. You walked through it with respect, the same way you'd walk quiet past a grave. The Scots-Irish settlers who came later brought their own explanation, and it leaned toward the otherworldly. They called such spots fairy rings, or hag ground, or simply cursed patches, echoes of old world stories about places where the fair folk didn't want visitors. A spinning compass, to them, wasn't a mineral vein. It was a sign that something unseen was standing close enough to bend the iron in your pocket. What nobody argues with, believer or skeptic, is that these spots exist in numbers too high to laugh off. Compass anomalies, gravity hills, spots where dogs won't cross, where cattle won't graze, where the fog seems to gather thicker than anywhere else on the ridge. Different names, different decades, same strange shape to the story, scattered across half a continent like beads dropped from the same broken string. Maybe it's all iron and illusion, tricks of old rock and tired eyes. Maybe the mountains really do carry pockets nobody's ever going to map, hidden 300 million years deep, still pulling at the needle after all this time. The surveyors keep coming back with better instruments, and the readings keep coming back strange. Somewhere in these hills, right now, a compass is spinning in slow, patient circles, waiting for someone to walk close enough to notice. There is a field in Watauga County that has not seen a plow in over 100 years. You can find it if you know where to look, tucked between two ridges like a green coin dropped in a fold of cloth. The grass grows there thick and healthy. The soil is dark and rich. By every measure a farmer would use, it should be some of the best growing land in the county. And yet, generation after generation, the families who owned that land let it sit empty. The old folks called it the waiting field. Nobody could tell you exactly why, not in a way that held together, but they all agreed on one thing. You did not put a plow to that ground. You did not build a house on it. You let it be. A man named Elijah Coffey owned that land back in the 1880s, and his family kept a ledger book that survives today in a historical society, 2 counties over. In it, Elijah wrote about clearing timber on every parcel he owned except one. His words were simple. He wrote that the field by the low ridge gave him a feeling he did not like, and that his mules would not walk into it without being driven hard. He never explained it further. He just left the field alone and moved his fences around it, like a man stepping around a puddle he cannot see the bottom of. His grandson inherited the land in the 1930s and tried to farm it anyway. That story got passed down with more detail, because it ended badly enough to be worth telling. The corn he planted came up pale and thin, though the same seed thrived 20 feet away on the other side of the fence line. His cattle would graze right up to the edge of that field and stop, as if there were a wall there only they could see. After 2 bad seasons, he gave up and let the weeds take it back. Nobody in the family ever tried again. And here is the part that pulls at people even now. When soil surveyors came through the region decades later, mapping mineral content for the state, they found something strange about that particular patch of ground. The magnetic readings spiked and dipped in a pattern they could not explain by the local rock. It was not dangerous. It was not even large, maybe half an acre at its center. But something under that field was different from the ground around it, different enough to register on instruments that do not care about old stories. Geologists have a few ideas. Some point to buried iron deposits, small pockets left behind by ancient mountain building. The same forces that pushed up these ridges long before the Rockies existed. Iron in the ground can twist a compass needle and unsettle an animal that senses the world through more than sight. Others suggest a shift in the underlying rock strata, a fault too small to matter on any survey map, but large enough to change how water moves beneath the surface, which would explain the pale corn and the different soil chemistry no one had measured yet in Elijah's time. But there are people in that county, older folks whose grandparents told them the story the same way it was told to Elijah's grandson, who believe the land itself remembers something. Not a curse, nothing so dark as that, more like a mark left behind, the way a stone in a riverbed still shows the scar from where a bigger stone once sat. Some say a Cherokee village stood near there before the roads came through, and that certain ground was set aside and never disturbed for reasons tied to belief rather than soil. No grave markers have ever been found. No artifacts have turned up in the few times the ground was disturbed for fence posts or drainage pipe. If there was ever a reason written down, it did not survive the way Elijah's ledger did. What survives is the field itself, still empty, still green, still humming faintly on a magnetometer. If you bring one out there today, you can walk to the edge of it and feel nothing unusual at all, just mountain air and the smell of clover. The cattle on the neighboring farm still will not cross the old fence line, though nobody living remembers teaching them to avoid it. Whether that is instinct passed down through generations of animals, or something in the ground pulling at a sense we no longer trust in ourselves, nobody in that valley can say for certain. The ledger book sits behind glass now, its ink brown with age, its questions unanswered, and the field waits the way it has always waited, empty and patient, holding whatever it is holding, just beneath the grass. Ask a family in Burke County about Brown Mountain, and you won't get a legend. You'll get a memory. They'll tell you about the summer their grandfather drove them up Highway 181 in a truck with no air conditioning, windows down, waiting for dark. They'll tell you about sitting on the hood, sharing a thermos of coffee, watching the black shape of the mountain against a sky full of stars. And then, if the night was right, they'll tell you about the light, a small point of gold or red, rising slow from the ridge, hanging there like a lantern held by no hand at all, then sinking back into the trees like it had somewhere else to be. This is not one story. It is hundreds of stories, told at hundreds of tables, each one polished a little differently by the person doing the telling. Ask 3 generations of the same family, and you'll get 3 versions. The grandmother swears the light was blue and moved fast, darting side to side like a firefly the size of a house. Her son remembers it as slow and steady, more like a candle carried up a staircase nobody could see. His daughter, who saw it just last year with her boyfriend's binoculars, calls it orange and says it flickered like it was breathing. None of them are lying. That is the strange part. The light seems to change its nature depending on who is watching, and when, and from where. Some families say it only comes in autumn, when the air turns crisp and the leaves start to drop. Others say they have seen it in the dead of summer, hovering over the same ridge on a night thick with humidity. There is no calendar to it, no clock. It comes when it wants, and the mountain keeps its own schedule. What every version agrees on is the shape of the feeling. People describe a kind of hush that falls over them right before the light appears. The crickets go quiet. The wind seems to hold its breath. And then, there it is, rising over Brown Mountain, like something remembering how to be born. Nobody in these stories describes fear. They describe wonder, the kind that makes a person go still and reach for the hand of whoever is sitting next to them. The written record backs up the family tables more than you might expect. Reports of the light go back to the 1800s, long before headlights or electric grids could take the blame. A United States Geological Survey team studied it in 1913 and again in 1922, testing for train lights, brush fires, and reflections off distant towns. They ruled most of it out and admitted the rest was hard to explain. Later theories point to ball lightning, swamp gas, or a rare kind of atmospheric refraction that bends distant light sources through layers of warm and cool air stacked over the valley like sheets on a bed. That refraction theory has real weight behind it. The area around Brown Mountain sits above a patchwork of valleys, rivers, and low ground that can trap warm air beneath cooler layers on certain nights, bending light, the way a spoon bends when you look at it through a glass of water under. The right conditions, distant car lights or train lights 40 miles away could appear to hover directly over the ridge, stretched and colored by the atmosphere into something that looks alive. It is a tidy explanation, and it fits a good number of the sightings, but it does not fit all of them. Witnesses in the early 1900s reported the light decades before the region had highways bright enough to explain a glow of that size. Some describe movement that refracted light should not be able to make, sharp turns, sudden drops, a kind of intention that a bent headlight beam simply doesn't have. Geologists studying the area have also noted mineral deposits and quartz veins running through Brown Mountain, raising quieter theories about piezoelectric charge, the kind of energy quartz can release under pressure, though nobody has proven the mountain produces enough of it to glow. So the families keep telling it their way, because the science, however careful, has never closed the door all the way shut. Grandparents still drive their grandchildren up that same stretch of 181. They still sit on the hood of a car, pour coffee from a thermos, and wait. And when the light rises, gold or blue or orange, slow or quick, breathing or still, it doesn't matter which version they inherited. For a moment, the whole family sees the same thing at once, and the mountain, old as anything in this range, keeps doing what it has always done. It lets them wander. Deep Under the ridges of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, there are tunnels that no map shows. Miners dug them by hand 100 years ago, chasing seams of coal through rock older than most life on Earth. Some of those tunnels are still down there, flooded and dark, holding the shape of men who worked them. The coal towns are mostly gone now. You can find the bones of them if you know where to look. A row of foundations grown over with sumac, a church steeple leaning sideways in a field, a store sign, rusted through, still hanging from one nail over a door that opens onto nothing. The miners who worked these mountains left behind more than empty shafts. They left stories, passed down at supper tables and on porches, about the things they saw underground. Some talked about tapping sounds that came from empty tunnels. 3 knocks, and then silence. Always 3. Old-timers called it the sound of the mine ghosts, warning the living to get out before the roof came down. Geologists have an answer for the knocking. Coal seams shift under pressure. Rock settles. The mountain groans the way an old house groans at night. Wood and stone finding new positions after years of strain. A miner standing in the dark, lamp burning low, might hear that groan as 3 distinct knocks. Fear does strange things to sound. So does silence, when it stretches long enough to fill a man's ears with his own heartbeat. But the miners believed something else too. They believed the mountain knew who worked inside it. They left offerings, sometimes a bit of bread, a swallow of coffee poured out on the tunnel floor, before they went down for a shift. Not because a company man told them to, because their fathers had done it, and their fathers before them. Going back to Wales and Italy, and the hollows of Cherokee country alike, it was a habit built from respect, the kind you show something bigger than yourself. Whether the mountain accepted those offerings, nobody can say. What is certain is this: the mines that ran deepest into these old rocks were dangerous in ways science can fully explain. Methane pockets, unstable roofs, water tables shifting without warning. Men died in those tunnels, more men than the official counts ever recorded, because record-keeping in a coal camp was often as thin as the paper it was written on. So the stories of tapping ghosts and mountain spirits were not separate from the danger. They grew directly out of it. A miner who heard 3 knocks and left his post might have saved his own life from a collapse he couldn't yet see or feel. Call it superstition if you want. Call it also a kind of memory, carried in sound instead of words, teaching each new generation of miners what their bodies could not yet know how to read in the rock. The land itself remembers this, even where the towns have vanished. Walk certain ridges in McDowell County or up toward Harlem, and you will find the ground pocked with sunken circles, old shaft entrances slowly filling in from decades of rain and frost. Trees grew crooked around them, their roots finding a different kind of soil below, mixed with coal dust and rusted iron. Local families still warn their children to stay clear of those hollows, the same warning passed down from grandparents who worked the seams themselves. This is the quiet truth sitting underneath every ghost story in coal country. It is not really about whether spirits tap on rock. It is about people who trusted a dangerous world enough to keep working in it, day after day, generation after generation, because the mountain fed their families even as it threatened to take their lives. The folklore became a way of holding both truths at once, respect and fear, side by side, the way smoke and firelight sit together in the same small room. You can drive through these hollows today and see almost nothing left standing. But if you slow down, if you walk instead of drive, you will feel it. The old grade of a rail line, grown over with grass, a chimney standing alone where a house used to be. The mountain does not advertise what happened here. It simply keeps the shape of it, folded into the land, like a hand closing slowly around something small and precious. Nobody living can tell you exactly what the tapping was, not with certainty, not in a way that would satisfy every geologist and every grandchild of a miner both. But everyone agrees on this. Something happened underground in these mountains that changed the people who worked there. It gave them caution, it gave them stories, and it left behind tunnels that still hold the cold and the dark, waiting the way old places wait, patient as stone, for someone to remember them. Come with me now to the deep coves, where night falls faster than anywhere else in the mountains. The sun drops behind a ridge, 2 hours before the sky admits it. Shadows pour into the valley like water filling a bowl. By the time the last light leaves the treetops, you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. Stand still. Feel the cold settle into the hollow, thick and slow, like syrup poured into a jar. The ground holds the day's heat for a while, and you can feel it rising through your boots, even as the air above turns sharp and biting. Somewhere close, a creek runs over stones, and the sound of it fills the dark like a voice that never stops talking. This is the hour when the old settlers said the panther calls. Some called it a mountain lion, some called it a painter, the old word that came down from the Scots-Irish tongue. Whatever the name, everyone agreed on one thing. Its scream sounds like a woman crying somewhere in the trees, and it will stop your heart cold the first time you hear it. Listen close now. It starts low, almost like a moan, then rises into something sharp and human. It climbs high enough to sound like a scream torn straight from someone's throat. Then it breaks, and the mountain swallows it whole, and the silence after feels heavier than before. Old-timers say a person never forgets that sound once they have heard it in the dark. Some nights, the cry comes from one ridge. Other nights, it seems to answer itself from 2 ridges at once. The mountains do that to sound. They bend it, bounce it, throw it back at you from a direction it never came from. Cry that starts on your left might land on your right ear a heartbeat later, and you will spin around looking for something that was never there. Naturalists will tell you it is only the mating call of the eastern cougar, an animal some say vanished from these hills 100 years ago. Wildlife officials mark the species extinct on paper, gone from the maps and the record books. Yet hunters keep hearing that scream on ridges where no cougar should exist anymore. Tracks show up in creek mud, too clean and too large for a bobcat, then wash away before anyone can cast them. Others say it was never a panther at all. They say it is something older, a woman who wanders the ridgeline still, searching for a child lost long ago in the fog. The old families passed that story down through generations, whispered over supper tables and porch rails. A woman who died grieving, they say, and the mountain kept her voice the way it keeps everything else, folded into stone and root and hollow air. Whatever walks. Out there tonight, you can feel its presence without seeing a thing. The dark presses close, but it does not feel cruel. It feels old, patient, and strangely gentle, like a hand resting soft on your shoulder. Above you, the sky opens wide between the ridgelines, a river of stars pouring from one black peak to the other. Out here, away from any town light, the stars burn so thick they look like frost scattered across the sky. You can hear an owl start up somewhere below, low and steady, a sound that feels almost like a friend keeping watch beside you. The wind moves through the hemlocks with a sound like a slow breath let out. Every few minutes, a branch cracks under its own frozen weight, and the sound rolls down the hollow like a dropped stone in a well. Nothing here rushes. Nothing here hurries you along. And then it comes again, that scream, farther off this time, drifting down from some high notch you cannot see. It rises, breaks, and falls into silence, and you find yourself holding your breath without meaning to. The silence that follows is not empty, it feels full, like a held breath of its own, waiting to see if you will answer. You will not see the Panther tonight, real or spirit, flesh or memory. You are not meant to. The mountain does not give up its secrets for the asking. It only lets you stand here a while, feel the cold rise from the ground and the vastness fall from the sky, and remember that some things howling in the dark were never meant to be explained. Some things were only meant to be heard and carried home in your chest like a secret you did not ask to keep. There is a hillside in the coal country of West Virginia where the grass grows thick and green, and if you did not know better, you would walk right past it. But the old folks know. They will point to the slope and tell you, right there, under that ground, there used to be a church. It was a small white church, the kind you see in every mountain town, wood siding, a steeple no taller than a barn roof, a bell that rang out on Sunday mornings and carried for a mile down the hollow. Families walked to it from 3 directions, following footpaths worn smooth by generations of boots. It sat at the base of the ridge for almost 80 years, and then, in the space of one bad spring, the hillside came down and took it. The old-timers do not talk about it as a tragedy exactly. They talk about it the way you talk about weather, like it was always going to happen, like the mountain had simply been patient. The rain that year was heavy and long. Underneath that slope ran an old drift mine, dug decades before, and abandoned, its tunnels left to rot in the dark. Water got into the seams. The ground got heavy with it, heavier than the old timbers below could hold. One night in April, the whole hillside let go, slow at first, then all at once, and the church went down into the earth like a stone dropped in a well. Nobody was inside when it happened. That is the detail everyone repeats, like a small mercy they still cannot quite believe. The bell rang once on its own, they say, as the steeple tipped and sank, one long low note rolling down the hollow before the ground swallowed the sound whole. Some folks say they heard it from half a mile off. Some say they still hear it, some evenings when the fog sits heavy in the valley and the wind comes down just right off the ridge. The geology behind it is plain enough. Old mine subsidence is common all through coal country, wherever men dug tunnels and left them without filling them back in. Water erodes the pillars. Rock settles into empty space. It happens slow, then it happens fast, and there is rarely warning worth trusting. Engineers can show you the old maps, the mine shafts marked in fading ink, running right under where the church once stood. There is no mystery in the mechanics. The mystery is what came after, because the town never filled that hillside back in and never built there again. Not out of law, out of feeling. The land sat quiet for years. Then someone planted grass on it, and the grass grew thick, like something trying to heal over a wound. Folks started calling it Church Hill, even though there was nothing left to see but slope and sky. Every spring, on the Sunday closest to the day it happened, the old families still climb that hill together. They bring no shovels, no markers. They just stand at the top of the slope, and someone says a few words, and somebody always claims they can hear that bell, if the wind is right. It became part of how people here think about the ground itself. You grow up in that hollow, learning that the earth is not always solid, that it keeps its own memory, that it can hold a building for 80 years and then decide quietly to take it back. Mothers tell their children to listen to the mountain, not just look at it. Old miners will tell you the ground has moods, same as a river or a sky, and you learn to read it if you want to stay safe living against it. Geologists say there is nothing supernatural in any of this. Subsidence is subsidence. Water is water, and old mines are dangerous no matter what stood above them. But ask anyone from that hollow whether the mountain simply took the church back, and most will tell you yes, that is exactly what it did. Not with anger, not with cruelty, almost gently. The way an old hand closes slowly around something it has decided to keep. Nobody plans to build there again. The grass keeps growing, green and easy, like nothing at all is underneath it. But walk that hill in the evening fog, when the light goes soft and grey, and the hollow goes quiet, and you will understand why the family still climb it every spring. Some ground, once it takes something, is allowed to keep it. The bell is still down there somewhere, silent now, but not forgotten. And the mountain, as far as anyone here is concerned, is still listening for the next thing it might decide to call its own. A hiker named Dale Whitson walked the whole Appalachian Trail back in 1974. He grew up in a coal town in West Virginia, one of those places where the hillsides had already started swallowing the old buildings whole. His grandmother told him about a trail near their home that didn't behave right. She called it the Wandering Path, and she said it never came out where you thought it should. Dale carried that story with him for 2,000 miles. He told it to other hikers at shelters in Georgia, in Virginia, in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Each time he told it, the story picked up something new. A hiker from Maine added snow. A woman from Tennessee added a light that followed you home. By the time Dale reached Katahdin, the story wasn't quite the one his grandmother told him. It had grown, the way moss grows over a fallen log, filling in every crack with something green and living. His grandmother's version was simple. She said there was a path behind her family's farm that always took you somewhere different, even if you walked it the same way twice. Sometimes it brought you out by the creek, sometimes it brought you out a half-mile down near the old churchyard. She never called it magic, she just called it contrary, the way you'd describe a stubborn mule or a door that wouldn't stay shut. Dale believed her, the way children believe their grandmothers about most things, without question and without much thought. It wasn't until he was grown, walking his own long trail, that he understood why the story stuck to him the way it did. He'd walk for hours through fog thick as wool, and the trail markers would seem to shift under his feet. A blaze on a tree that should have been dead ahead turned up on his left. A switchback he swore he'd already passed showed up again an hour later. Same rock, same bent sapling, same patch of moss shaped like a hand. Trail guides will tell you. This happens on foggy ridgelines all through Appalachia. Fog bends light and swallows sound, and a tired hiker's mind fills the gaps with pattern where there isn't one. That is the practical answer, and it is probably the right one most of the time. But Dale used to say the fog wasn't playing tricks. He said the mountain was just old enough and stubborn enough to have its own opinion about which way a man ought to go. He carried the story to Ohio, where he settled after the trail, and he told it to his own children on porches, far from any mountain fog. He told it slower each year, the way old men do, savoring the parts that used to scare him. His daughter grew up thinking every mountain had a path like that behind it, one that watched you, one that judged whether you deserved to find your way home, easy or hard. Folklorists have a word for stories like this. They call them migratory legends, tales that travel with people the way seeds travel on the wind, landing wherever the wind sets them down. The wandering path shows up under different names in different hollows, from the Alleghenies down through the Blue Ridge. Sometimes it's a road that loops back on itself near a graveyard. Sometimes it's a creek bed that leads travelers in circles until dawn breaks the spell. The details shift, but the bones stay the same. Somebody gets turned around. Somebody swears the land moved instead of them. Geologists have their own bones for this kind of story. Ridge country plays tricks on the eye, they say, with switchback trails that fold back near themselves more than a straight map would suggest. Add fog, add fatigue, add a mind eager to find meaning in confusion, and you get every version of Dale's grandmother's tale, born fresh in 100 different valleys without anyone borrowing from anyone else. That theory holds up fine in daylight. It gets thinner after dark, when the fog rolls down off the ridge, and the trail behind you seems to close up like a door. Dale died in his 80s, far from any Appalachian ridge. But his daughter says he asked about the path near the end. He wanted to know if it was still there, still contrary, still leading travelers home by paths they never chose themselves. Nobody could tell him for certain. The old farm had changed hands twice, and the woods had grown thick over whatever trail once ran behind it. That's the nature of a story like this. It doesn't need the original ground to survive. It just needs someone willing to carry it, mile after mile, fog or clear sky, until it belongs to a whole new stretch of country. The mountain that gave it birth might not even remember its own legend anymore. But somewhere, on some porch, somebody is still telling it. There is an old road in the mountains that shows up on no map you can buy today. Locals call it different names in different hollows. Some say the Wagon Trace. Some say the Old State Road. Some don't name it at all. They just point with a chin and say, that one, the one that goes up past the church that fell in. You can still walk parts of it if you know where to look. The pavement gives way to gravel. Then the gravel gives way to 2 ruts in the grass. Then even the ruts disappear under 100 years of leaf fall. But the shape of it stays. The mountain remembers where the road wanted to go, even after the road itself is gone. Walk it in October, when the leaves have started to turn and thin, and you can see the old grade cutting sideways across the slope, like a scar that healed wrong, but healed on purpose. Every family up here has a story about that road. A grandmother who walked it barefoot to a dance. A peddler who vanished on it during a snow that came from nowhere. A preacher who claimed he met a stranger on it at midnight. A stranger who knew his name and knew his sins, and then simply was not there anymore. No footprints leading off into the trees, no sound of him leaving. The road carries these stories the way a creek carries leaves. It just keeps moving them along, generation to generation, and nobody asks the creek to explain itself. That is maybe the last true thing to understand about this whole stretch of mountains. The stories do not need the geology to make sense, and the geology does not need the stories to be real. They ran alongside each other for 300 years, sometimes touching, sometimes not, like 2 roads that cross at a single point and then head off in different directions forever. Scientists have gone a long way toward explaining pieces of it. They can tell you why the tunnels form in limestone, slow water-eating rock, over 10,000 years. They can tell you why the balds might be old Cherokee burns, or old grazing land, or a fungus that killed the beech trees a century back. They can point to warm air pooling in valleys and call it a simple inversion. They can measure the hum in Whiteside Mountain and say it is wind moving through stone in a particular way. Nothing more. Every one of these answers is probably true, and every one of them leaves something standing in the doorway, refusing to leave, because nobody has caught the brown mountain lights on an instrument that satisfies everyone. Nobody has found the bottom of the sinkhole they call the punch bowl. Not with rope, not with sonar, not yet. Nobody can say for certain what makes the ground shake along the coast on a still day when there is no storm and no quarry blast to blame. The Panther screams still get reported, decades after most maps stopped drawing panthers in these mountains at all. The compass still spins in that one hollow in Tennessee, and the surveyors still shrug, and the old-timers still nod, like they knew it would. Maybe that is the real shape of these mountains, not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a kind of agreement between the rock and the people who live on it. The rock keeps some things to itself, the people keep the stories going. Between them, something gets preserved that would not survive an explanation. A church swallowed by a hillside, a bridge nobody built, a trail that circles back on itself no matter how carefully you walk it. You could spend a lifetime up here, chasing down every light and every hom and every hollow where the fog refuses to leave, and you would come away with maps and readings and photographs, and you would still lie awake some night, wondering about the one you could not pin down. That is not a failure of science. That is just what these mountains are. They are 300 million years old, worn down, soft and secretive, and they have had a very long time to learn how to keep a secret. The old road is still there, under the leaves, going where it always went. Somewhere past the fallen church, past the field nobody would farm, up toward the ridge that still breathes fog on clear mornings. It does not lead anywhere, marked on a modern map. It leads to the next story, and the next family who will tell it, and the next stranger who will walk it once, just to see, and come back down the mountain a little quieter than before. The fire is just embers now, orange and soft, like the last light on a mountain at day's end. You've been sitting with these stories a long time. Let the mountains sit with you now, just for a little while longer. Think of what you've heard tonight. A lake that swallowed a whole valley without warning. Lights that walk the ridge at Brown Mountain, unclaimed by any wire or flame. A cave that some folks say has no bottom at all, and a river that old stories swear once ran the wrong way. A panther's scream that sounds too much like a woman crying. A church folded into a hillside, a bridge nobody living remembers building, a trail that keeps going after the map says stop. None of it adds up to one neat answer. That's the truth of these mountains, and maybe that's the whole point. Geologists will tell you plenty. They'll tell you these are some of the oldest mountains on Earth, worn soft and round by more time than the mind can hold. They'll tell you about cast rock and sinkholes, about warm air pooling in valleys, about limestone dissolving slow into tunnels and caverns. They have good answers for a lot of it, but not all of it. Brown Mountain still glows for reasons nobody can fully pin down. The Seneca guns still boom over water, with no storm in sight and no ship on the horizon. Compasses still spin in certain hollows for no clear course. Science has worn down plenty of these mysteries the way water wears down stone. But a few pieces remain, hard and strange, right at the center. Maybe that's how the mountains want it. Old places don't give up everything. They keep a little back, the way a person keeps one story they never quite tell in full. The Cherokee knew this land before any road cut through it, and they gave these ridges care and respect, not fear. The settlers who came after brought their own words for the same wonders, ghosts and haints, and things half seen in fog. Different tongues, same mountain, same hush. And that hush is still here. Right now, somewhere in Appalachia, fog is rolling low through a hollow, thick as wool, catching the moonlight and holding it soft, like a lamp behind a curtain. Somewhere, A creek is running quiet over stones that have not moved in 10,000 years. Somewhere,